You'll regret this, I won't obey, native girl said when the cowboy paid $2 for her at the auction. The sun was just beginning to rise over the dusty small town, casting long shadows across the main street. Today was not like any other day. Today was the day of the local auction. People from surrounding farms, ranches, and towns had started gathering early, their boots crunching on the dirt, their voices mixing with the low hum of excitement and curiosity. The smell of hay, dust, and leather hung in the air, mingling with a faint aroma of coffee and baked bread from nearby stalls. Among the crowd was a group of children laughing and running between the stalls, while men and women of all ages haggled over livestock and farm tools. But today the auction would feature something unusual and, to many, shocking. Alongside horses, cows, and chickens, there were items for labor, helping hands for the ranches. It was a practice rooted in history, a reflection of times that were rough and often unfair. And this was where the native girl appeared. She stood tall despite her nerves, her dark eyes scanning the crowd. She was young, maybe 17 or 18, with long black hair tied neatly behind her head. Her clothes were simple but clean, a reflection of her careful upbringing. She was not timid, though her heart raced as she realized what this day truly meant. She had seen the auctions before, seen people, men, women, sometimes even teenagers, bought for labor. It was humiliating. And now, she was standing in front of a crowd that could treat her the same way. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a crooked smile, raised his hand and called the next lot. The girl's stomach tightened, but she refused to look scared. She planted her feet firmly on the wooden platform and lifted her chin. Her voice when she spoke was strong and clear. "I will not obey anyone. I will not be controlled." Some people in the crowd laughed nervously, unsure if she was speaking to them or just to herself. Others frowned, clearly irritated at her defiance. In a place where obedience and silence were often expected, her words cut sharply through the air. The auctioneer waved his hand impatiently, muttering something about the spirited girl as he prepared to start bidding. Then, a figure moved forward through the crowd, a cowboy, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a hat that shaded most of his face. He had a reputation in the area for being quiet, careful, and fair, though many didn't truly know him. He didn't yell or shove his way through the people. He walked slowly, calmly, as if he didn't need anyone's approval. When he reached the front, he didn't speak at first. He simply looked at the girl. The girl stared back, her eyes narrowing. She had heard stories about men who came to the auctions, some kind, some cruel. She didn't know which type this man would be. But there was something different about him. He didn't carry a whip or a harsh look. There was no hint of mockery in his gaze. Instead, there was a quiet, steady calm that made her pulse beat a little slower. Not because she trusted him, but because he seemed different. The auctioneer began calling out numbers, raising the stakes in his usual loud and exaggerated manner. $10, $15. Who'll give 20? But when the cowboy spoke, it was almost a whisper, yet it carried across the platform. $2. The crowd fell silent. $2. It was barely more than a token, a number that seemed absurd in a place where people expected high bids. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Some people laughed, some shook their heads, some whispered to their neighbors. But the girl didn't laugh. She didn't frown either. Instead, she stood straighter, her defiance burning brighter. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice strong. "I won't obey." The auctioneer blinked. He had not expected her boldness. The crowd leaned in, curious, eager to see what would happen next. Some thought she might break down. Some thought she might strike out in anger. But she didn't do any of that. She just stared at the cowboy, her arms crossed over her chest, her posture unyielding. The cowboy tilted his head slightly, as if studying her words carefully. He didn't raise his voice or threaten her. Instead, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and said, "I understand. I'm not here to make you obey." "You will not be forced." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some were shocked that a man at the auction would say such words. Others, especially women, looked at the girl with admiration. Here was someone who had the courage to speak her truth, to stand firm in a moment when many would have bent or cried. Still, the girl's heart pounded. She had no reason to trust anyone. She had been taught to be wary, to protect herself in a world that often treated people like her unfairly. And yet, this man, this cowboy, was different. She didn't know if she could believe him, but at least he wasn't yelling, he wasn't forcing, and he wasn't laughing at her. Finally, the auctioneer called the bid final. The cowboy's $2 had won. A few people muttered under their breath, expressing disbelief that someone would pay so little. But the girl felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. She was no longer at the mercy of the crowd. The outcome, while odd, had given her some control. The cowboy stepped forward, offering his hand in a gesture that was meant to be civil, not commanding. "Come with me," he said quietly.
"I'll take you home. You'll be safe."
The girl hesitated, her pride flaring. She was used to taking care of herself. She had survived on her own, navigating a world that often ignored her people or treated them unfairly. To accept his help felt strange, almost threatening. But she looked around at the crowd, at the whispers and stares, and realized she didn't have many options. She could either walk away into uncertainty alone or take a chance on someone who, at least so far, had shown restraint. She took a deep breath and nodded once. Not because she trusted him, but because she knew she had to keep her options open. She stepped down from the platform, and the cowboy guided her gently through the crowd. The townspeople parted silently, their eyes following them. Some were judgmental, some curious, some surprised that she had maintained her dignity throughout the ordeal. As they walked toward the cowboy's ranch, the girl's mind raced. She kept repeating her words in her head. "I won't obey. I will not be controlled." It was a promise to herself. She would remain true to her independence, no matter what came next. The cowboy walked beside her quietly, careful not to speak over her thoughts. He seemed to understand that trust had to be earned, not demanded. Every step along the dusty road was a reminder of the strange, delicate balance between freedom and survival, between courage and caution. Along the way, the girl noticed small things. The way he had dusted the straps on the horses without harsh words, the way he gave space to the animals, treating them kindly. These were small signs, but they mattered. In a world that often showed cruelty, kindness was a rare gift, and she noticed it immediately. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was higher, casting golden light across the wide fields. The house and stables were simple but well kept. The cowboy gestured toward the space they would share, not as a command, but as an offer. "You have a choice," he said quietly. "You can stay and help, or you can leave. I won't force you either way." The girl's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever offered her such an option before. Usually, people expected obedience. They expected fear. But here, she had a choice. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something close to hope. She crossed her arms and looked out across the fields, her defiance still strong. She would not be a passive participant in anyone's story, not now, not ever. But perhaps in this quiet place, she could find a way to protect herself while also learning to navigate the strange new world she had stepped into. The cowboy watched her carefully, respecting her space, respecting her will. He knew trust could not be forced, only earned. And as they stood there, side by side but still distant, both realized that this meeting was the start of something unusual. Something that would challenge both of them, test their patience, and perhaps in time, teach them about respect, dignity, and the power of choice. For now, though, the auction was over. The crowd had dispersed, leaving behind only the dust of the day and the memory of a girl who had refused to be silenced. And in that quiet moment, the girl and the cowboy faced each other across the dusty yard, two people bound not by money or ownership, but by the fragile beginnings of understanding. The girl's words echoed softly in the air. "I won't obey. You'll regret this if you try." And the cowboy, calm and steady, replied in his heart, though not aloud, "I don't intend to try." It was a small beginning. But in that beginning lay the promise of courage, of respect, and of the choices that would shape the days to come. The sun climbed higher in the sky as the native girl followed the cowboy toward his ranch. Each step felt heavy in her mind, weighed down not by the distance, but by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had never been inside someone else's world like this before. Her life had been her own to manage, her own battles to fight, and her own rules to follow. Now, she had to navigate a place and a person she did not yet understand. The ranch was quiet, with the soft sounds of animals moving in the stables and the occasional creak of a wooden gate swinging in the wind. The cowboy led her past the fields where horses grazed peacefully, their heads bobbing as they chewed grass. He did not speak much, but his presence was steady, like the ground beneath her feet. It was calm, predictable, and somehow reassuring. When they reached the small house on the ranch, he gestured toward the doorway. "This will be your room," he said simply. "It's basic, but you'll have privacy." The girl's eyes scanned the space: a simple wooden bed, a small dresser, a window letting in sunlight. She was surprised. She had expected rough treatment, harsh words, maybe even punishment. Instead, it was ordinary. Safe. And that made her wary. She had learned that sometimes ordinary was a trap. "I don't need anyone to take care of me," she said, crossing her arms. "I can manage. I know," the cowboy replied without judgment. "I'm not here to manage you. You'll do what you choose. I won't interfere." Her eyes narrowed slightly. His words were calm, but she could sense sincerity. He wasn't saying this to appear noble or kind. He truly meant it. And that both unsettled her and sparked a small flicker of curiosity. She had been treated as a possession before, as someone who could be bought or controlled. Here, someone was offering her freedom within the walls of his ranch. That was almost alien to her. Days passed, and the tension between them remained. The girl refused to follow orders or perform tasks unless she wanted to. She worked only when she chose, moving through the stables and fields with quiet efficiency. The cowboy watched her, careful not to hover a command. He noticed her strength, her determination, and the pride she carried in every step. One morning while feeding the horses, she paused, glancing up at the cowboy. "Why did you pay for me?" she asked bluntly. $2 isn't much. You could have walked away." The cowboy leaned on the fence, looking out over the field before answering. "I didn't buy you as property. I paid to make sure you weren't treated unfairly. $2 was all that was needed to stop others from taking advantage of you." The girl frowned, thinking about the cruelty she had seen in auctions, in towns, in homes. "And what if I don't want to stay?" "Then you leave," he said simply. "I won't stop you. No one should be forced to stay where they do not want to be." The girl's chest tightened. No one had ever offered her a choice like that. People had always acted as if they knew what was best for her, as if her life could be decided by others. Here was someone who acknowledged her voice, her will, and her freedom. It was almost overwhelming. Still, trust did not come easily. Each time the girl moved through the ranch, she kept her senses sharp, alert for any hint of trickery or cruelty. But day by day, she began to notice the small things. The cowboy fed the animals patiently, never striking them. He repaired broken fences without complaining, and he did not speak harshly to anyone who worked for him. Even in his silence, she could sense fairness. One afternoon, while the girl was mending a fence, a sudden commotion erupted near the stables. One of the horses had bolted, panicked by a loose gate. The girl froze, unsure if she should act. The cowboy, however, was already moving, his voice calm but firm as he approached the horse. "Easy, easy," he said, carefully guiding it back with patience and steady hands. The girl watched him, impressed despite herself. There was no yelling, no fear-mongering, just skill, patience, and care. She realized then that his strength was not in forcing obedience, but in guiding with respect. She felt a flicker of admiration she had not expected. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the girl sat outside her small room, thinking about the day. She had been cautious, careful, and defiant, yet she could not ignore the strange sense of safety she felt on the ranch. The cowboy had not tried to control her. He had not demanded anything she was unwilling to give. That in itself was almost revolutionary. The next few weeks followed a similar rhythm. She worked when she wanted, rested when she needed, and spoke only when she felt it necessary. The cowboy respected her boundaries, sometimes offering advice or help, but never imposing it. Slowly, she began to see a side of him that few others did. A man of integrity, of quiet principles, someone who valued fairness above dominance. One afternoon, while repairing a broken wheel on a cart, she muttered under her breath, "Maybe he isn't like the others." The cowboy, who had been nearby, looked at her quietly. "Maybe I'm not," he said simply. She turned sharply, surprised that he had heard her. She did not know if she should be angry, embarrassed, or curious. His calm presence was unnerving, yet comforting. She realized he was listening, not to control her, but to understand. Days later, she decided to test him. She intentionally left a task unfinished, expecting him to scold or force her to complete it. But when he came by, he simply nodded. "You'll finish it when you are ready," he said. No anger, no judgment, no threats, just respect. The girl felt a strange mixture of frustration and relief. She had spent her life fighting for control over her own decisions, and here was someone offering her that control voluntarily. She did not yet trust him fully, but she could feel her defiance softening, replaced by cautious curiosity. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky turn orange and pink, she asked him about his life. "Why do you treat people like this?" she asked. "Why not just do what everyone else does?" He looked out over the fields, his eyes thoughtful. "Because it matters. How we treat others defines us more than anything else. I've seen cruelty, and I've seen its consequences. I want to do better. I want to live in a way I can respect when I look back." The girl considered his words. They were simple, yet they carried weight. She had never met anyone who thought about their actions so carefully. Most people acted out of habit, fear, or power. Here was someone who acted out of principle. Trust began to grow, slowly and unevenly. She still kept her distance emotionally, still refused to follow any orders blindly, but she started to see the cowboy not as a threat, but as an ally. She noticed how he treated others, workers, neighbors, and even strangers, with fairness. She realized that his actions matched his words, and that consistency was rare and valuable. One afternoon while working in the stables, she almost laughed at the irony. He had spent years defending herself, preparing for cruelty and unfairness, only to find a place where kindness was the norm. She caught herself looking at the cowboy, noting how he moved quietly among the animals, how his voice remained calm, even in difficult situations. She didn't smile, not yet, but inside, she felt the beginnings of trust. A storm approached one evening, dark clouds rolling across the hills and wind picking up the dust. The girl felt nervous, unsure if the horses would panic or if the gates would hold. She hesitated, unsure what to do. Before she could act, the cowboy appeared, securing the gates and calming the animals with quiet words. "You don't need to panic," he said. "We'll get through this together." She felt a small wave of gratitude and relief. She had not relied on anyone in years, and yet, here she was, learning that sometimes help did not mean weakness. Sometimes it meant survival, patience, and careful collaboration. That night, as lightning flashed across the sky, she thought about the journey she had been forced into by the auction. She had expected cruelty, fear, and obedience. Instead, she had found challenge, learning, and cautious respect. She still carried her pride, her independence, and her defiance. But now, she also carried a new understanding, that strength could exist alongside trust, and courage could coexist with cooperation. By the end of the second week on the ranch, a quiet routine had settled. She was still cautious, still vigilant, but she began to see the cowboy not as a captor, but as someone who could be trusted to respect her choices. They had not spoken of friendship or loyalty yet, but a foundation had formed, a fragile, careful connection built on respect, patience, and shared understanding. For the first time since the auction, the girl felt that maybe she could survive this new chapter on her own terms, not by submission, but by observation, intelligence, and careful trust. And she knew that the days ahead would continue to test her courage, her patience, and her willpower. But she also knew that, with the cowboy's quiet presence and the safety of the ranch, she might just discover a way to navigate this strange new world while remaining true to herself. Days turned into weeks, and the native girl began to feel the rhythm of life on the ranch. She still carried the fire of her independence, but a subtle change was happening inside her. The cowboy whose presence had once been distant and measured was slowly becoming someone she could observe without fear, someone whose actions and words were quietly shaping her understanding of trust and respect. One morning she was feeding the chickens when the cowboy appeared at the edge of the yard. He carried a small bucket of feed for the horses, moving with ease and confidence. She paused and watched him. There was no rush, no command in his movements, only patience. She had come to notice these details, how he handled every task with care, how he treated the animals kindly, and how he avoided unnecessary conflict. It was different from anything she had ever known. "You're improving with the chores," he said gently, not as a demand, but as an observation. She glanced at him, feeling a mix of pride and irritation. "I don't need praise," she said, though the corners of her lips almost twitched. "I'm not praising," he replied simply. "Just noticing. That's all." It was this calm honesty that made her cautious curiosity grow. She realized she could learn from him without losing herself, without surrendering her independence. In a way, she had never had someone acknowledge her efforts without expecting obedience in return.
As the days went by, small conversations began to bridge the distance between them.
One afternoon, while mending a torn blanket in the corner of the barn, she asked him, "Why do you help people who don't ask for it? Why do you go out of your way for animals, for neighbors?" He looked at her thoughtful, then shrugged lightly. "Because someone has to. I can't change the world, but I can make a difference where I am. I don't expect thanks. I just do what I think is right." She paused, absorbing his words. They were simple, yet they carried a weight that made her think. She had grown up in a world where fairness and kindness were rare, where people often acted out of selfishness or fear. Here was someone who acted differently, who lived according to principles rather than power. Over time, she began to share pieces of her life with him, not fully, but enough to let him understand that she was more than what the auction had reduced her to. She spoke of her family, the struggles of her people, and the pride she carried in her heritage. She told stories of her childhood, of the forests she had wandered, the rivers she had fished, and the lessons she had learned from elders. The cowboy listened patiently, never interrupting, never dismissing. He asked questions at times, not to control her, but to understand. And slowly, she realized that he was genuinely interested, that he valued her knowledge, her culture, and her perspective. It was a foreign experience for her, to be treated not as property or a laborer, but as a person whose thoughts mattered. But trust was not easy. One afternoon, a group of travelers passed by the ranch. They had heard of the girl and were curious about her story. They laughed at her, asking if she was the one the cowboy bought for $2. Their words stung, and for a moment she felt the old anger and defiance rise within her. The cowboy appeared at her side, calm and steady.
"Ignore them," he said quietly. "Their words mean nothing."
"You decide what matters, not them." She looked at him, and for the first time she realized that his presence was not controlling or threatening. It was protective, without being overbearing. She still carried her pride, but she also felt a strange sense of gratitude. She was not powerless here, not if she did not allow herself to be. Weeks turned into months. The girl began to take on more responsibility around the ranch, not out of obligation, but out of choice. She repaired fences, fed animals, and even helped with small repairs around the house. The cowboy never told her what to do. He only offered guidance when she asked. One day, as they worked side by side repairing a fence, she decided to test him in a subtle way. She intentionally struggled with a heavy post, waiting to see if he would take over. He watched her silently for a moment, then stepped forward. "Do you want help?" he asked calmly.
"I can do it," she replied firmly, though she knew she might need assistance.
"Then do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here if you need me, but I won't do it for you." She hesitated, then tried again, pushing with all her strength. The post finally settled into place. She looked at him, eyes shining with pride. He simply nodded, a small smile forming at the corners of his mouth. It was a gesture of approval, not ownership, and that made her heart feel lighter than it had in months. Their conversations became deeper over time. They spoke of life, of choices, of fairness and justice. She asked about his family, about how he had come to live on the ranch. He told her stories of hard work, of lessons learned from mistakes, and of the importance of living with integrity. She shared stories of her people's traditions, their struggles, and the wisdom of her elders. Each story they exchanged built a bridge between them, one built on respect and understanding rather than fear or control. One evening, a storm rolled over the ranch. The sky darkened and the wind howled through the fields. The girl felt a flicker of panic. She had seen storms before, but this one felt different, more threatening. The horses were restless, and the small animals scattered in fear. She froze, unsure how to respond. The cowboy appeared at her side, calm as always. "We'll handle it together," he said quietly. "Stay close and watch. You'll learn how to keep things under control." Together they moved through the stables, securing gates and calming the animals. He showed her how to speak gently, how to move carefully, and how to anticipate the animals' reactions. She followed his guidance, but she also learned to trust her instincts, realizing that she could act with confidence and courage. By the time the storm passed, she felt a quiet pride. She had faced her fear, guided by someone who did not command her, but who taught her how to act with skill and care. This experience became a turning point. She began to see the cowboy not as a captor or even just a protector, but as a teacher in a very real sense. Not someone who imposed control, but someone who helped her understand her own strength. She began to trust him slowly and cautiously while still maintaining her independence and pride. They shared small moments of laughter as well. One day, while repairing a broken wheel, the girl accidentally tipped a bucket of nails. The clatter echoed across the yard. She braced for scolding, but the cowboy simply shook his head with a quiet chuckle. "Not every mistake needs anger," he said. "Learn, fix it, and move on." She realized that this approach was foreign but effective. Mistakes were not punishable offenses. They were opportunities to grow. For someone like her who had lived under constant scrutiny and threat, this was a revelation. Through these shared experiences, a bond formed. It was not friendship in the conventional sense, nor was it loyalty demanded by power. It was a bond built on respect, trust, and understanding. They began to anticipate each other's actions, to communicate with subtle gestures and quiet words, and to navigate challenges together. Yet the girl never lost her sense of self. She remained outspoken, proud, and independent. She still reminded him, sometimes sharply, that she would not obey blindly, that her choices were her own. And he continued to respect that, never forcing, never overstepping, always giving her the space to assert her will. By the end of several months, the ranch felt less like a place of uncertainty and more like a space where she could grow and thrive, on her own terms. The cowboy had not changed her or demanded her submission. He had simply offered guidance, respect, and the freedom to choose. And in that freedom she discovered the beginnings of trust, understanding, and cautious friendship. For the first time since the auction, she felt that she could navigate the world without losing herself. She still carried the memory of that moment on the platform, the words she had shouted in defiance, but she also carried something new, a sense that strength could coexist with trust, that independence could coexist with collaboration, and that courage could be expressed not just through defiance but through understanding and measured action. And as the sun set over the ranch, painting the fields in shades of gold and orange, she stood side by side with the cowboy, not as a subordinate or captive, but as an equal in her own right, learning, observing, and beginning to trust. The journey was far from over, and challenges would come again, but for the first time she felt a fragile hope that maybe, in this unexpected place, she could find safety, respect, and the chance to define her own life. The months on the ranch had changed everything for the native girl. She was still proud, strong-willed, and independent, but she carried a new sense of confidence, Life on the ranch had taught her lessons she could never have learned anywhere else. Patience, observation, understanding, and the quiet power of respect. The cowboy had never demanded her obedience, never tried to control her, and never treated her as less than a person. For the first time, she felt a freedom that did not come from fleeing danger, but from choosing her own path. One morning she woke early, before the sun rose, and walked to the edge of the fields. The sky was painted with soft pinks and blues, and the air was crisp and fresh. She thought about how far she had come since the auction, when she had shouted, "I won't obey." That moment had been her defiance, her armor, her way of protecting herself from a world that often treated her as less than human. Now she realized that courage could take many forms. It could be defiance, yes, but it could also be understanding, skill, and measured trust. The cowboy appeared at the barn doorway, carrying buckets for the animals. He noticed her standing quietly among the fields. "You're up early," he said softly.
I like the morning, she replied, shrugging slightly. It feels...
"Come." He nodded, understanding more in her silence than in words. Together they moved through the routine of the morning, feeding animals, checking fences, and repairing tools. She worked alongside him as an equal, her skill and independence respected, her choices always her own. Weeks later, the girl made a decision that surprised even herself. She would go into town, not for chores, not for supplies, but to assert her presence in the world she had once feared. She had been cautious before, wary of townspeople and strangers who might mock or underestimate her. But she realized now that courage was not just about defending herself. It was about claiming her space, her dignity, and her voice. The cowboy noticed her determination and simply nodded. "Do what you need to do," he said. "I'll be here if you need me, but I trust you to make your own choices." The town, as expected, was a mixture of curiosity and judgment. People whispered, some recognizing the girl from the auction. Some stared, some laughed, and a few looked at her with newfound respect. But she held her head high, walking steadily through the streets. She spoke when she needed to, asserting herself with quiet confidence. She paid for supplies with her own money, answered questions about her work on the ranch, and even helped a neighbor with a small task. By the time she returned to the ranch, she felt a deep sense of pride. She had faced the world on her own terms, and it had not broken her. She realized that the cowboy had not changed her. He had not tried to mold her into someone she was not. Instead, he had given her space, respect, and guidance, and she had used that freedom to grow stronger. Life continued on the ranch, and the girl became more skilled, more confident, and more aware of her own strength. She managed tasks, learned new skills, and even began teaching the cowboy small lessons about her culture and traditions. In quiet moments, they would sit together on the porch, sharing stories about their lives, their hopes, and their experiences. Each story, each shared lesson, built trust, understanding, and mutual respect. One day a challenge arrived that would test both of them. A severe storm approached, stronger than any they had faced before. Winds whipped across the fields, animals panicked, and the sky turned dark and threatening. The girl's first instinct was fear, but she also felt a surge of determination. She had faced storms before, both literal and metaphorical, and she knew she could act. The cowboy moved calmly, securing gates, checking fences, and guiding the animals. He offered quiet instructions, but never commands. She followed his guidance, learning not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Together they managed the chaos, keeping the ranch and animals safe. When the storm finally passed, the girl realized that courage was not only about standing against injustice. It was about acting with skill, intelligence, and composure in difficult moments. The days after the storm brought reflection. The girl thought about the journey she had been through, from the auction platform where she had shouted her defiance, to the long, quiet days on the ranch where she had learned to trust and understand. She realized that true strength was not about being unyielding in every moment, but about choosing when to stand firm and when to allow guidance, when to assert independence, and when to collaborate. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she made another decision. She would speak to the cowboy about her future, not as a demand, not as a plea, but as a statement of choice. She walked to where he was repairing a fence, tools in hand. "I need to talk to you," she said firmly. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'm listening," he replied. "I've learned a lot here," she began. "I've learned that I can trust, that I can act, and that I can choose. I don't want to be controlled, and I don't want to obey blindly. But I also see the value in respect, patience, and understanding. I want to continue learning, not because I have to, but because I choose to." The cowboy listened quietly, a small smile forming on his face. "Then you have my support," he said, "always. Your choices are yours, not mine." For the girl, those words were more powerful than anything else. They confirmed that her independence had been preserved, that her dignity had not been compromised, and that she had truly been respected as a person. She realized that this was the rarest form of trust, one that honored her decisions, her voice, and her life. Time passed, and the girl's presence on the ranch became both a source of strength and a symbol of resilience. She was no longer the frightened or defiant figure from the auction platform. She was a young woman who had faced the world, asserted her independence, and learned to navigate life with intelligence, courage, and careful trust. The cowboy, too, had changed in subtle ways. He had learned patience, empathy, and the value of earning trust rather than demanding it. Their bond was not one of ownership, but of mutual respect and understanding. They worked together, spoke together, and even disagreed at times, but always with recognition of each other's dignity. One afternoon, the girl stood at the edge of the fields, looking out at the horizon. She thought about her past, the auction, and the difficult journey she had endured. She realized that her courage had carried her through, but that her ability to learn, observe, and trust had allowed her to thrive. She had faced fear, defiance, and uncertainty, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. The cowboy approached her, standing silently beside her. He did not speak, but his presence was steady and comforting. She looked at him and smiled faintly, a small gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. It was a smile that said, "I am who I am, and you have respected me. I have faced the world, and I am unbroken." Later, as the day ended and the sky turned shades of gold and purple, she knew that her life would continue on her own terms. She could stay on the ranch, learn more and grow stronger, or she could venture into the world, confident in her abilities and her choices. There was no fear, no coercion, only trust and understanding. And in that moment she realized the truth. Freedom was not just about escaping danger or defiance. It was about having the power to make choices, the courage to act on them, and the knowledge that respect could exist even in the most unlikely of places. She had found that freedom on the ranch, alongside someone who had offered guidance without control, patience without judgment, and respect without condition. As the sun set completely behind the hills, the girl felt a quiet pride. She had survived the auction, defied expectations, learned to trust without losing herself, and claimed her voice. She had transformed fear into courage, defiance into understanding, and independence into empowered choice. She knew that challenges would come again, but she also knew that she could face them with strength, intelligence, and dignity. The cowboy standing beside her nodded silently, as if acknowledging the journey they had shared. They did not need words to express their understanding. In the quiet of the evening among the fields and animals, a bond had formed that was rare, valuable, and built on the strongest foundation of all, respect. The girl smiled again, this time with a full sense of self-assurance. She had survived the world that had tried to define her, she had claimed her space, and she had learned that strength was more than defiance. It was wisdom, courage, and the ability to act with dignity. And so her story on the ranch reached a place of resolution. She was free, not because anyone had given her freedom, but because she had taken it through courage, learning, and choice. She had faced injustice, defiance, fear, and uncertainty, and had emerged unbroken, empowered, and ready to live life on her own terms.